Hollywood film, like all popular culture, is constantly shifting through phases, and the early 2000s was a markedly different landscape than it is today in terms of franchise entertainment. Superhero adaptations, then more of a gamble than a guarantee, having not yet established that shared universe model, were yet to dominate in the way that they would over the following decade or so, given their often diverse quality.
Catnip.
With the more successful ones setting a then unprecedented, mature tone in the genre in live action. Original IP that wasn't by default seeking franchise expansion felt a lot more commonplace. Reboots and sequels weren't at their current saturation point. Now a real sign of commercial and creative safetyism that's led to a development by committee of sorts, particularly in light of streaming services where audiences are treated like users to curate for. Combine that with the issues around post-pandemic cinema attendance and ever vocal, ever demanding fandoms to appease, this safetyism becomes ever more important to the industry's bottom line. A recent, quite egregious example of this is the J.J. Abrams-led The Rise of Skywalker, the last Star Wars film for 7 years after a 5-film yearly run. Clearly stunned by the very toxic social media discourse around the unoriginal plot for The Force Awakens and the blatant expectations subversion and supposed identity politics of The Last Jedi.
Get this man off my bridge.
Disney's retreat to tried and tested formulae as a means of fan appeasement was ultimately the franchise's undoing.
Somehow Palpatine returned.
And J.J. Abrams hasn't directed since. It's hard to imagine, given his legendary, now perhaps infamous status, that his directorial debut only came 13 years before The Rise of Skywalker in Mission Impossible 3. There too, Abrams was trusted to continue an established series with its third installment, but given that its release was a full decade prior, and itself being a movie adaptation of an older TV show from the 60s, it was already bordering on legacy sequel status before that term was really commonplace. But Abrams managed to revivify the franchise with his kinetic set pieces, breakneck narrative pacing, and inspired casting.
Do you have a wife, girlfriend?
Setting up the franchise for another 2 decades of box office success under Chris McQuarrie.
Holy fucking shit.
So when a long gestating idea for a Star Trek prequel found its writers in Alex Kurtzman and Roberto Orci, their frequent collaborator J.J. Abrams was asked to direct, again responsible for bringing a somewhat struggling franchise across film and TV to a new generation in a new light. And again, his musical partner to do so was once again none other than lifelong Trekkie Michael Giacchino. Enter Star Trek 2009. Much of his preceding career, J.J. Abrams had made a name for himself with TV sci-fi, like Lost, Alias, and Fringe. Giacchino was in partnership across them all, developing various new sounds and production styles in the process. But by Mission Impossible 3, it was his now famously Williams-esque kinetic modernism that was perfectly primed for that film's new direction. Reorienting it away from Hans Zimmer's sound world for Mission Impossible 2, one of technologically tinged breakbeats and rocky reworks. Not to mention its soundtrack placements. Giacchino's voice here arguably dignified the franchise somewhat through that late 2000s zeitgeist of dark and grounded adaptations, and therefore their appropriately serious music. But the hardness and seriousness of these new adaptations at that time may be attributable to wider cultural or geopolitical considerations. As Sommerfeld states, Star Trek 2009's neoconservative outlook takes hold. Starfleet functions as an intergalactic armada rather than the benevolent governing body. This NATO-like alliance is tasked with peacekeeping activities and defense from unknown threats, the menaces that exist in space. The optimism of the utopian future promised in the original series is still present, but in a rather conservative and backward-looking form. And these less optimistic, more nuanced facets, likely the result of being the first post-9/11 franchise refresh, permeated the whole reboot, from its new level of violence and realistic visual effects its immediate and visceral sense of threat. And even perhaps the hard sci-fi elements of the alternate reality plot. This branching off of the Kelvin timeline, as it would come to be known, was an inspired means of rejuvenating pre-existing beloved characters with their own continuities while leaving the original untarnished. But it was arguably a nostalgic look backwards, or indeed sideways, at a time when audiences perhaps needed it. Giacchino could have opted to lean into that nostalgia, but as we'll hear, he and Abrams had other ideas. Much like Star Wars, with its mixed audience and critical responses to its various entries,
He's embarrassing.
an apparent universal strength of both franchises is its music. Perhaps while Star Trek's scores from Alexander Courage's original main theme through to Jerry Goldsmith and James Horner, may not have reached the very unique popular acclaim of Williams's singular Star Wars work. Goldsmith's score for the first film quickly cemented itself as an integral part of Star Trek's sound world in a really meaningful way. Originally for the motion picture in 1979, his new main theme was reused and became equally emblematic of the Next Generation series and its subsequent films. And by the time of Voyager's rise to prominence, Goldsmith was invited back to compose that main theme for its new female-fronted era of the franchise. Hardly a surprise for a composer who, through countless innovations of his masterful orchestral command, is often cited by fellow composers as being one of the best.
You ask musicians, they might think he's the best ever.
So no pressure, Giacchino. It may have been intimidating for a relatively young composer joining the ranks of elders responsible for such heritage brand affiliation, but by 2009, Giacchino was no novice. He cut his teeth early on with hugely acclaimed work for video game series, Medal of Honor, Call of Duty, and Jurassic Park, to name but a few. Many seeds were planted in the wider film music discourse at that time, remarking on Giacchino's real fluency in Williams's language. And then perhaps his potential inheritance of his status. Spielberg himself called him a young John Williams. Those franchises, games which were inspired or produced by, if not directly based upon, Spielberg pictures, are rife with John Williams references for that reason. So it's safe to say he had a lot of practice. And while the game world is easier, at least at that point, to rest on pastiche of the source inspiration, he wielded those references tastefully and authentically where he needed to. Importantly, as we discussed in the last episode, Williams in turn borrows from many of the greats of bygone eras. So for a fuller breakdown of that system of reference and citation, go check out episode 9. It was likely his cinematic video game scores that landed him more film work throughout the early 2000s. He gained further prominence in animation at Pixar, where following the departure of Bond legend John Barry from The Incredibles, he was asked to replace his archetypal espionage sound. And for Up, where he won his first and so far only Oscar. No, I can't. A major point of distinction between his Mission Impossible and Star Trek work, though, is the use of pre-existing themes. While the original Lalo Schifrin theme had been reused by Danny Elfman for the first film, and then recontextualized in that rocky way by Hans Zimmer for the second, Giacchino was much more faithful to Schifrin's original, somewhat unsurprising given he was a clear influence on his incredible score in much more than just the 5/4 time signature homage. But Giacchino's new rhythmic and brass-heavy muscularity set it apart from its predecessors. It was a successful blueprint, continued then by his successors like Lorne Balfe and Joe Kramer, combining those main theme references with an even newer, modern percussive sound. And it's also a signature he had masterfully redeployed for Star Trek's new identity. Giacchino has referenced Goldsmith's own work for Planet of the Apes as a seminal influence across all of his work. It may have been a key influence across both films. But Goldsmith's theme for Star Trek, having become such a cornerstone of Star Trek's brand identity, wasn't reused by Giacchino at all.
It didn't seem to work in the middle of the movie because the film is about the genesis of the crew on the Enterprise, how they came to be together, and that doesn't happen till the end of the film because it wasn't earned. It needed to be something you earned.
Withholding nostalgia in this way would be a rare degree of compositional restraint in today's context of franchise IP reboots, multiverses, and even concurrent iterations of the same character across different films. I imagine due in part to that development by committee to appease those fandoms. This is how messy shared musical identities can become. So in The Batman, another Michael Giacchino score, there is no allusion to any pre-existing Batman character motif from any film by Tim Burton, Christopher Nolan, even Joel Schumacher. It's expected then, perhaps, given Matt Reeves' Batman's hermetically sealed continuity, the score shares more harmonic similarity with its Nirvana soundtrack placement than it does with any pre-existing Batman content, so not too messy. But a year after its release, an older Batman in a newer film reappeared with an older theme. Benjamin Balfish, to his credit, tastefully and appropriately reuses Danny Elfman's Batman theme to accompany Michael Keaton's return to the character in Barry Allen's visit to the Tim Burton universe.
I'm Batman.
While in theory, back in his universe, Ben Affleck's Batman is swinging around to Hans Zimmer and Tom Holkenborg's motif for that iteration. Complicated, but not so much musical nostalgia chasing, more just the film itself. But in 2017's Justice League, for any Marvel or DC multiversal madness, in a very meta example of thematic reuse, Danny Elfman redeployed both his Batman theme
How many of you are there?
Not enough.
and John Williams' Superman theme.
He's back.
To accompany completely different iterations of those characters, whose very tenuous multiversal link was only confirmed in a film 6 years later. And then most recently, in the new Superman by James Gunn, John Murphy and David Fleming lift subtle but very present nods to John Williams' original theme, particularly its second half, and done in a fittingly 2025-esque quantized production style. Through this reuse, the film quite quickly becomes a comparative experience, one that breaks down the fourth wall and makes an audience immediately cognizant of the unoriginality of the whole reboot experience and perhaps the derivative nature of the film itself. And given that in this Superman Superman, a huge character motivation for him was contending with allegiances to his parents or his new life on Earth. It'd surely be more prudent in this context then to cast off these musical forebears in favor of forging a new identity. Now, to be more forgiving, perhaps Superman's canonization in Hollywood cinema more widely, due to both John Williams' omnipresence in the medium and the quality of that individual score, makes filmmakers believe that no other melody can ever become meaningfully emblematic of that character. There's just too much cultural baggage. But I think it's far more likely a means of nostalgia porn, and again, that creative safetyism. But in Star Trek 2009, Giacchino took a different approach. In perhaps the prototypical multiversal film for at least our current era, the ensemble are, in theory, just a younger recast of the characters from the original series and motion pictures, just branched out onto that alternate timeline to maintain some stakes. Yet despite that narrative proximity, which is rife for musical nostalgia bait, pre-existing material is absent. It's a level of compositional boldness that may just be symptomatic of our current era's less motivic scoring conventions, but given Giacchino's demonstrable command of melody, I think it was more likely a confidence and trust in the audience to grow new attachment to new musical forms, a trust he also had for his Batman score, but one becoming less and less frequent in the wake of other franchises having difficult to trace musical continuities. But in Star Trek, you hear that confidence in this new musical direction from the very first note of music. He opens with a solo horn line in D minor, slow and melancholic, but still projecting heroism over a low-register synth and harp bed with these otherworldly metallophones. In Giacchino's theme, the tragic perfect fourth and the minor third in the melody represent challenges the characters face throughout the Star Trek reboot. The loss of planets Vulcan and Romulus, the loss of Spock's mother and nearly all of his race. So it's already melodically tracing that tragedy and adversity of this iteration, but by virtue of sonic proximity to fanfare through its monophonic brass, it also traces the triumphant perseverance through this adversity. Goldsmith's score begins with the more traditional convention of an overture, a practice originating in the early Romantic period, and one which in the sci-fi context notably accompanied 2001: A Space Odyssey, one of many influences on Star Trek's first big screen outing. The immediate difference is the tonality and orchestration. The opening of Goldsmith's overture reads as major. Its dominant chord orientation with a flattened sixth in the melody harmonically allude to a chromatic median or a borrowing from the Aeolian mode for its sixth chord. And along with the very lyrical string section, it all comes to exemplify the wonder and majesty of space exploration, a buoyancy of spirit that is emblematic of the old Star Trek's optimism. Goldsmith chose to employ a musical language inspired by romanticism and not avant-garde, with his association of Star Trek with a better world where we can live in peace and tranquility with one another. This modal borrowing is the harmonic makeup of Ilia's theme, an alien character who quite directly exemplifies this beauty and majesty in The Unknown.
My oath of celibacy is on record, Captain. May I assume my duties?
Valiance.
Following the overture, Goldsmith's opening titles are now an iconic moment across the franchise. Seemingly influenced by John Williams' Golden Age scoring revival of somewhat from 2 years prior in Star Wars. Compared to Giacchino's somewhat somber opening, it's comparatively joyful, an optimistic march into the unknown. Goldsmith parallels this directly to the score John Williams had written for Star Wars 2 years prior, and also compared the concepts of discovery and exploration with the Old West, a genre on which Goldsmith had also worked many times earlier in his career, and states his approach as being opposite to his experimental approach for Planet of the Apes. The key connotations to the Old West may lie in the widely spaced fanfare, while Goldsmith's is orchestrated around in a much more late Romantic fashion. Courageous had a much more overtly 20th century American inspiration from the likes of Aaron Copland. Rather than the American frontier, is the final frontier.
Space.
These musical emblems of perseverance, curiosity, and heroism are utilized in film profusely through the optimism of much of science fiction, but also a more war-oriented heroism like we heard earlier in Saving Private Ryan. In Talbot's breakdown of Giacchino's main theme, he states it's significantly different from that of previous Star Trek themes, texturally and melodically, but the triplet figure has traditional significance with heroic actions. The melody features traits of the Dorian mode and imbues the listener with a sense of tense melancholy. The melody represents the new Enterprise. The triplet figures represent the myriad of occurrences in Star Trek where the triplet appeared. While the aesthetic and timbre is different from the original, Giacchino references it almost subconsciously through very subtle metric, harmonic, and melodic citation. Metrically, he incorporates these triplets of heroism, albeit in a more somber fashion, at the end of each measure. There's also a subtle melodic reference through a partial chromatic descent, which we can see, if not hear, compared to Courage's original theme, shares more than a passing reference. Even if the overall mood of the piece is less buoyant. And finally, harmonically, Courage's second measure sits atop a flattened dominant chord, giving an intriguing tritone modulation of sorts with that fifth chord. Giacchino uses a similarly chromatic alteration, opting for a flattened second or Neapolitan chord in his third measure. Different kind of gravitas, but it's an equally unpredictable harmonic footing for the listener. His opening theme rounds out relatively quickly with a pulsing crescendo in brass, building huge anticipation, and a whole year before Zimmer's rework of Edith Piaf did much the same, with seemingly every trailer for the next decade and a half also doing the same. A huge overblown rip on the horns throws us headlong into the opening action sequence and into that very new, very real peril of the opening act. In Star Trek The Motion Picture, we're also launched into a space battle, but true to the film's overall pacing, it's a much slower burn, a more tactical, submarine-like warfare situation. This staple of Star Trek set it apart from the likes of Star Wars and their frantic dogfights. Goldsmith's technological innovations shine here through his then unfamiliar blaster beam instrument, signifying the alien cloud's inexplicably superior technological warfare. In an early allusion to interdiegesis, it also reads as the weapon's in-world diegetic sound. For the enemy V'ger cloud, Goldsmith employed the then newly developed blaster beam. Incidentally, Robert Wise intended for Goldsmith's score to largely take the place of sound effects. This can be considered appropriate since Goldsmith himself stated the necessity of music being primary, i.e. it should make the effects, and not the other way around. But Giacchino's space battle immediately reads as more cosmic horror in how both music and image portray the sheer scale of Nero's ship as it emerges from the wormhole. There's a simple but effective chromatic low-register horn line, which is weaved into multiple cues throughout for its allusion to the menace of the villainous Nero. Of course, chromatic low brass being an omnipresent idea for villainous figures in general. A convention from opera, now a trope of film, as all of this is, but aptly for this opening sequence and true to Holst's planetary archetypes, it also quite directly signifies the bringer of war. This all amounts to a super effective way to demarcate a literal generational leap in the stakes, urgency, and pacing that this new franchise iteration seeks to portray. But Giacchino is not all brass and bravado. We only need to look again to his Oscar winner Up to understand his deep command of musical pathos, particularly around familial loss. It becomes clear that George Kirk will need to sacrifice himself to fend off Nero's ship. Scoring this scene straight with all its action in our established D minor key center would be a huge one-dimensional disservice to the emotional significance of this sacrifice. So Giacchino expertly scores it as a moment of joy tinged with tragedy. In the cue Labor of Love, accompanying Jim's birth, he opens in D major, with triplets providing a triple meter that has a waltz or lullaby-like feel for this new arrival. This waltz feel also occurs in the opening of Up, as Carl and Ellie are dancing through life with one another. And both cues share harmonic similarity in the use of the major seventh degree as bittersweetness or longing. In Up, as we see their aging, it reminds us of the sadness of a fleeting life. And here in Star Trek IV, the joy of new life, tinged with the tragedy that the father will never be able to meet the son. It's punctuating more than just a momentary beat. It's the driving emotional anchor behind this Jim Kirk's ascendancy to greatness. From a mix standpoint, the dulling, or in this case, the complete omission of sound effects, so that only music remains to guide our emotions, amplifies that pathos tenfold. Roll VT. It can border on cliche, but if the surrounding film has audience buy-in around authenticity, it's still a powerful technique. It has countless examples across a range of emotions, but is particularly effective when talking about grief or loss. As Jim's mum escapes, the major seventh from the father's sacrifice goes home to the root of D, playing out on high register strings in relative isolation, with her ever smaller in the frame, escaping with Jim alone. And here we hear the main ostinato for the first time. It's higher tempo, together with the accidental major seventh with the new minor key center, as per Nero's earlier villainous brass theme, gives a tension reminiscent of the whole tone half tone scale, but also a playful buoyancy for the lucky escape, a perfect summary of this film's tone. Ostinati are a common rhythmic and melodic device, particularly in action scoring, for its ability to evoke pace and momentum. They've become ever more prominent in modern scoring too, as the majority of scores are now produced using sample libraries whose most convincing sounds are those short percussive ones, as they don't require any artificial looping. It's a modern phenomenon where many modern composers are primarily music technologists, composing within the limitations of these approximations of the original instruments rather than those instruments' original non-technologized contexts. Goldsmith's score is far less ostinato-driven, perhaps due to his wider vocabulary of the orchestra's possibilities in that original context, but where he does use this device, it's similarly chromatic in its composition to project that same anticipatory tension as Giacchino uses. Another device of pathos in the score is Vulcan's identity. In this timeline, we see the destruction of Vulcan and the genocide of nearly all of its people. The sonic identity of this cultural weight is carried by the Ahu.
I went and I looked at a lot of different instruments, and I kind of settled on this instrument called an erhu, which is essentially a Chinese violin, and it has this beautiful, almost vocal quality to it, but it always sounds somewhat sad.
Its relative exoticism to the average Western ear is a kind of timbral shortcut to evoke otherness, but it's affecting here for Vulcan in the sheer expressiveness and fragility of the performance, and importantly, its placement within the other father-son relationship of this story, that of Spock and his father Sarek. Its fragility is befitting of the decimated Vulcan race, now hanging on by a thread. Through repetition, it comes to represent a lifelong struggle for Spock to balance his logical and emotional sides. We hear it plant seeds when, as a boy, Spock is told that his father married his mother for logic, while also being given his own choice between both of those paths. The first part of the line represents Spock's emotionality trying to emerge but being suppressed. We also hear it during his interaction with his human mother, the ancestral sanctuary of his emotional side, and the line evolves and is suitably embellished for this pull towards his humanity and emotion. Its next play is a very somber natural minor figure for Spock's captain's log when Vulcan is destroyed, a swan song of sorts, quite directly lamenting the deaths of Vulcan and all of its history. Then again, upon the death of Spock's mother, Sarek finally cathartically validates Spock's emotions, confirming that it was indeed a marriage of love.
You asked me once why I married your mother. I married her because I loved her.
The final and perhaps most poignant of this Ahu theme, at least for Trekkies, is during Spock's conversation with his older self. Again, there is a fatherly mentor kind of role solidifying that musical connotation, but it's finally himself, or at least an older version of himself, that breaks through that inner conflict of logic versus emotion to reach a deeper truth.
You will always be a child of two worlds.
It's made all the more impactful in this very meta moment as Leonard Nimoy's Spock
Father.
explains the significance of the other Vulcan-human relationship,
I am not our father.
that of Spock with Kirk.
I could not deprive you of the revelation of all that you could accomplish together, of a friendship that will define you both in ways you cannot yet realize.
Like the years of Vulcan history, the Ahu also underscores his reminiscing on these years of personal significance of that relationship. The audience likely feels and has already seen in the original series and movies. They feel it deeply, but the younger Spock doesn't yet understand. And now in this new timeline's context of grief and loss, it's fitting then that this friendship is beginning perhaps when he needs it the most. His new mentor in his older self gives his blessing to cast aside his sense of duty to rebuild Vulcan
Good luck.
and continue in Starfleet to embark upon this friendship. And the Ahu is a front and center signifier throughout. Ultimately, Michael Giacchino's work on Star Trek reiterated that a heritage franchise doesn't need to rely solely on the musical crutches of its predecessors to find its footing. By withholding Courage's iconic fanfare and theme until the last moment where these new characters have earned their association with it, having an intentional absence of the expected, Giacchino earns this legacy placement through his fresh characterizations and far more subtle citations. It retains the symphonic heart that defines the genre and the franchise, but doesn't shy away from a more modern cinematic context. The score turned out to strike out in a new branch, leaving the old thematic material behind for a new, omnipresent theme Giacchino uses in virtually every major cue. All over, Giacchino's score uses a simpler harmonic language and lacks the sci-fi adventure found in Goldsmith and Horner's Star Trek scores. Through this, he balances homage with his bold new flourishes while avoiding pastiche. It's a fine line to walk, but as we've seen, a heritage franchise's continuation can be most successful with trust in audiences to accept the new and not assume that they're chasing the past. Giacchino's now canonized reboot work continues to inspire Rami Malumad and Jeff Russo's amazing work on Star Trek's streaming renaissance. And while there's so much to explore there as well, it's clear that Giacchino was able to bridge a stylistic gap between the cerebral slow burn of the original series and the high-octane demands of the reboot. His North Star was always to serve the picture they were making while deeply respecting what came before. And for a generation of moviegoers, myself included, this score didn't just accompany a reboot. It was the sonic entry point to previously unknown universe, enabled by its broader accessibility. It reassured us that we didn't need to know the history of the Federation and the minute depths of the franchise lore to be swept up in its ideals. So thank you so much if you've made it this far. It's an absolute privilege to be able to write and talk about this incredible music that I've found so influential over the years. And the idea that people are listening to me drone on about it is incredible. So thank you so much. As always, like, comment, subscribe, drop me a message on what you thought, on what films you'd like to see me cover next. I'll be recreating one of my favorite cues from the film in Logic Pro, and I'll be posting that in the next few weeks. So keep an eye out for that. Of course, go back and watch some of the previous episodes because we've got 10 under the belt now. So we're going strong. Thank you so much for watching, and I will catch you in the next one.